practice, I'm going to focus on an issue similar to what Pat has described, but in a more macro sense. It's the same theme of trying to safeguard states' ability to regulate the public interest, and the premise of this presentation is that changes are needed to the standard U.S. investment chapters, minimum standard treatment rules, and there are some new cases to be described. I just start by pointing out the seriousness and breadth of the potential threat, which is to say, for the TPP, there are 2,500 corporations, 13,000 affiliates that would be cross-registered who would have the ability to use investor state. So for the developed country and emerging country partners in TPP, you look at, for instance, the case of, oh, the U.S. hasn't lost a case. And that's in the past because our FTAs have been with developing countries. So in the U.S. now, there's much more attention because, as you can see, for all of the countries, there are a large number of cross-registered corporations because there are a lot of net capital exporting countries in this partner. As well, the number of uses of this regime by investors has exploded in recent years. So previously it was the basically case of last resort. Nothing else worked, then you went to a tribunal. Now, as everyone knows, investors are using this as a strategy to lobby governments. Sometimes they never intend to proceed with the case. They just want to drag them into litigation. In other instances, there's now even financing through hedge funds for cases where the hedge fund gets a part of the profit. So the number of the cases is exploding, and it's a liability for governments. We went through all of the U.S. FTAs and BITs, and we found that the minimum standard of treatment, and particularly the fair and equitable treatment piece of it, is the basis for 75% of all of the cases where an investor wins against a state in which the investor wins. That's 23 cases, 17 wins. Now, everyone here is extremely familiar with this language. It's the boilerplate language. That's the language, NAFTA, the U.S. NAFTA had a different set of language. It got some rather interesting rulings. This has been the boilerplate MST language for a while. Now, under that language, there has been a pretty high return. This 81% of cases taken under MST, particularly under FET, the investor wins, is a blend of the NAFTA language and this language, which is just to say that's the case, that's the argument that is the strongest. This is a list of those 17 cases where the government has lost under an MST-FET claim under the U.S. FTAs. And there's some of the notorious NAFTA ones, there are 5 notorious NAFTA ones, but all the other ones are good cases. Now, this is an issue that Congress, that civil society groups such as ours has raised over and over to a point where Dan probably wants to cry when I say the word MST, but the USTR argument has been that that standard really only provides for compensation in the context of a denial of justice, FET, and a denial of justice is understood under customary international law, and that would be legit. You don't get access to a tribunal, a court, etc. Unfortunately, when we reviewed the 17 instances of FET rulings of the 23 published investor state cases under US FTAs and BITs, we found that actually what the tribunals did was much broader than that CIL standard, practically. And this elasticity has become a worrying trend throughout the body of investor state cases. So it's not just that US investors have been particularly fortunate in the tribunals that they got, nor that the US language is somehow different. This is across the board, the language is very similar. And I want to just send people to what I thought was a very useful large article by Professor Matthew Porterfield from Georgetown Law School, who's gone through in a lot of detail the fair and equitable treatment decisions under those agreements. It's just from this February. He basically concludes by saying that the TPP text needs to define FET specifically to narrow their rights, and that the Annex, which is on customary international law, which at that point hadn't been defined, had too much vagueness. Now, as we're going to see, the Annex has now been interpreted, and Professor Porterfield turns out to have been precisely right. He points out that arbitrators are using the uncertainty and discretion to import rulings about what the minimum standard treatment FET means from other tribunals, and not stick to actual practice of the states, and moreover, to come up with some very fanciful and dangerous for states' regulatory ability notion of reasonable investor expectations, a lot of which are just pulled out of the air by any particular tribunal. Some have been reasonable, some have been, well, highly unreasonable. Now, when we have raised this, USTR has mentioned the CIL Annex. That was included in FTA since CAFTA, and it was a legitimate attempt to try and fix what were some worrisome NAFTA rulings. That was a step in the right direction, but it hadn't been interpreted. And there was worry because it was a little circular. It didn't say, FET means this, and this, end of list. It said, the terms should be interpreted under customary international law. Here's the language, if you're familiar with it. It shows up in the TPP as Annex 2, as Annex B. The argument has been, as a result of this annex, there's no need for any more detail narrowing the actual FET standard or the annex being tightened. Except in June we had a ruling, finally. This is the first interpretation of that annex, of the CIL Annex. It's the Railroad Development Corporation versus Guatemala case under CAFTA. And it shows quite precisely that that CIL Annex is insufficient. Specifically, the tribunal explicitly rejected not just the argument by Guatemala, but as well non-party submissions by the United States, El Salvador, and Honduras, that under the CIL Annex, the tribunal must base its analysis on state practice of what fair and equitable treatment means. And that the tribunal denying that, and explicitly denying it. The tribunal went further and had some rather choice things to say, not the least of which were that the states actually misunderstood what CIL was. It's a rather cheeky, as awards go, it's rather amusing reading. The panel also took a swipe at near, suggesting that that case actually no longer made sense, which I'm sure international law professors everywhere had a nervous breakdown. The tribunal then decided with its discretion to import the definition under a NAFTA case, Waste Management 2, and to declare that Guatemala's initiation of what's called a lesivo process, it's a contract review process, was arbitrary, grossly unjust, unfair, and unjust, which is the standard from Waste Management 2. The tribunal went further to say that its view of why it didn't need to stick to state practice, nor should it be a problem that other tribunals are brought into the decision of a tribunal in deciding how to define the terms, is because MST rights are constantly in a process of development. Now, from the perspective of a state, this is very worrisome. As negotiators, you have to figure out what are you committing your government to? What is the commitment you're making? Because you have to live with it. You don't want something that's a constantly moving target, which with this annex is what this language, according to this tribunal, is. That's not to say that you don't want to set up a fair and equitable treatment standard or customary international law, so if there's a denial of justice, there's a way to deal with it. The data does show that it's unclear that there is a correlation between attracting investment and having these rules. But there is a way to have the rules without having that problem. It's also worth noting in that case, which I have two papers, two different papers. One is the data analysis. It also goes through the broad different interpretations in some of those 17 cases with citations to each one, so you can go back and read the importation. The other paper actually goes through the RDC case in some detail. And some of the other highlights to keep in mind in thinking about the need to narrow the standard is that there really wasn't a denial of justice in the sense that the company was in the process of using both the administrative procedure and the court, which are both available in this lesivo process. So the lesivo basically is notice you're going to have your contract reviewed. And then as the investor, you can contest it, first in the administrative process and then in the courts. And so RDC was literally in the middle of doing both things as they won their investor state case. And they were making money still on their concession. The contract had not been voided. There had actually never even been a decision. The very process of the review was considered an FET violation. It's also worth knowing, which is you had to import that broad standard to get to that. It's also worth noting that there was compound interest or to be paid from the time of the action, which is a lot of money and is a different issue, but for all investment negotiators, there is that set of brackets still in Section B with respect to interest, and that is a scary detail. So, yep, the sort of final point, which is obvious where I'm going with this, is no country wants to have its normal functions circumscribed by the threat of being dragged before a tribunal that can order having to pay compensation to foreign governments simply because there is a new policy, an alteration of policy, a policy that actually is non-discriminatory, like this Leesburg process that has due process along the way is used. Now, certainly there are cases where a government is going to do something that deserves for an investor to get compensation. But having the rules balanced properly is not what the old standard, as modified by the Annex, provides. And so I would advocate respectfully that negotiators consider altering both the MST language with respect to FET and or, I would say or also, tighten the CIL Annex to foreclose this kind of discretion. And again, prior to this CAFTA case, we didn't know. We could hope that the Annex had fixed the problem. But we know now, at least, it's not actually fixed. And as well, given there are so many pre-existing agreements, and this issue of coexistence is a sticky one where the investor will be able to, it seems, choose. It seems if this gets fixed in the TPP, which would be an enormous step forward, then there needs to be some kind of mechanism to make sure that the old rules can't be MFN claused in for an investor to choose to tack government under a wider definition. Thank you very much, and I have copies of both of the papers.